Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable, carbon neutral society, and I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thank you for joining the conversation today. As the climate and biodiversity crises accelerate, the world needs solutions that actively regenerate ecosystems and communities. Terviva, an ag tech company, has spent over a decade unlocking the potential of the Pongamia. It's a hardy tree that can restore degraded land while creating low carbon food and fuel alternatives. Marc Diaz, Terviva's chief commercialization officer, will join us for a conversation about the potential for the Pongamia in agriculture, for food, and sustainable aviation fuel. Marc brings decades of experience in sustainability in global markets, and we'll explore how the Pongamia is replacing citrus groves in California and Florida, empowering women farmers in India, and proving that commercialization doesn't necessarily require compromising climate impact or social equity. Through its Panova platform, Terviva transforms wild harvested Pongamia beans into healthy food ingredients while building an equitable supply chain from India to Australia. Recent partnerships with Chevron's Renewable Energy Group and Japan's Idemitsu are scaling the Pongamia for aviation and biofuel development. And at the same time, Terviva's Panova Foods division is developing regenerative ingredients for restaurants and food brands. You can learn more at terviva.com and at panovafoods.com. Panova Foods is all one word, no space, no dash, panovafoods.com. We'll get to the conversation right after this brief commercial break. Welcome to the show, Marc. How you doing today?
Doing great, Mitch.
Well, thank you for joining me. I've spent some time doing research on the Pongamia and the beans it produces. It's a stately looking tree, but tell us about the tree. What's it like to be in the presence of a Pongamia tree?
It's a marvelous tree, in part because it's a tree of many colors.
Hmm.
You find it as a street tree in some of the world's most urban locations. Whether you're in Miami or Honolulu or its ancestral home in India, the big cities of India are chock-a-block with
Hmm.
these hardy, vigorous growing trees that have a beautiful pink flower in the spring and produce these oil seeds, these these beans in a good abundance on an annual basis. In the countryside, the tree is used traditionally in communities as much of a boundary setting tree as a
Hmm.
shade tree that you or I might have in our backyard.
What makes it a unique and timely solution for both food cultivation and fuel production?
We're moving through a world that is increasingly unpredictable. And this moment that we're experiencing in our wider world is pitch perfect for the Pongamia tree. Um, the context for Terviva's energy over the last 15 years as a company, organized entirely around Pongamia, is to provide people with food and energy from a natural solution that's resilient, that's adaptive, that can deal with the shocks in the natural world, but also in our broader environment, our politics, our trade. And that's where Pongamia really shines. It comes out of a part of the world in the monsoonal areas of the world in the subtropics that is where more and more of our farmland is going. Extremes of dry and wet, extremes of heat in cold periods.
Hmm.
And it's really that volatility, those extremes where Pongamia can perform well, generate an abundant crop, make use of permanent agriculture in a time in which we have extremes of precipitation or temperature, and where we need more efficiency, more yield from the same acre of land, and can't afford to rely on the traditional crops that have gotten us here, the corn, soys, for example, the oil palms, right, that require lots of inputs and increasingly create lots of complexity, not just to deliver when the conditions aren't perfect, but also when our trade barriers suddenly cut off, whole regions of the world from affordable access to supply.
Well, now one of the most important things it does is restore the soil, and because it's a legume, like a pea plant, it helps move nitrogen into the soil. How does that compare to other types of crops? Is the Pongamia a superhero?
Well, we call it a super tree in part because it's a legume, as you said, and it fixes that nitrogen in a symbiotic way with the soils, right? So the great bargain it makes is by making its own biology accessible. It's a 5 or 7 meter tall plant. It's bringing all of those photosynthetic sugars into the soil system. It's getting, the nitrogen exchange it needs. But it's also got a few other superpowers that we like to talk about. One is it's got a powerful root system, both a surface spreading root and a deep tap root that help
Hmm.
to create a more permeable soil strata and allow water to be recharged, but also to be distributed within the soil for the tree's use in a way that's more flexible, more adaptive to those periods of dry and wet that you find in monsoonal regions. Additionally, we focus a lot on its natural bioactives. These bioactives are functionally defenses that the tree has accumulated over millions of years of evolution. They taste bitter. They taste bitter to you or I if we were to eat one of the beans off the field, and they
Right.
taste bitter to pests and to the things that often prey on plants in the natural world.
Hmm.
So, because those adaptive compounds are there, they reduce the need for things like pesticides, right? Which have those follow-on effects that are negative in the environmental context, but also cost a lot if you're a commercial producer. So we like that basket of the resilience, the soil strengthening, the water storage and water management capacity, and the fact that you have more biodiversity in the field, more resilience in the plant because of those bioactives.
Okay, so I see how it can be a major contributor to introducing more regenerative agricultural practices. But one crop, one monocrop isn't the solution either. How does the Pongamia coexist with other plants and potentially agricultural products that people might be looking for?
Yeah, great point. We think there's a world of incremental production that we need. So we're an all of the above advocate. We need to find a way to steward all the corn and soy and palm we already have because that's already spoken for. But people are going to need a lot more calories, a lot more electrons to move and to live in the ways that many of us get to live and move today as the
Mhm.
population grows. And so part of this is bringing areas that are out of production into production. I'll give you an example. One of the places I know well is Florida, state of Florida in the US. And I was a kid who grew up there in the 1980s, drinking my fair share of orange juice every day. And in the year 2000, 1 million acres of citrus was available for production in Florida. Citrus greening disease and a strong shift in markets for orange juice, which is the primary product those oranges were
Mhm.
delivering, has resulted in 3/4 of those acres going away. So 750,000 acres are available in a tough climate where there aren't a lot of obvious alternatives. People have tried annual crops, people have tried other tree crops, and they don't work so well. Pongamia drops into that land, which would otherwise be unavailable for food and energy production. And that's an example of one of the things we need to do to find those underused pieces of land and bring them back into production or bring them into more abundant production. The second thing to your point on what do we grow alongside Pongamia is to get more imaginative
Mhm.
around how we govern our farm fields. We luckily get to turn to traditional communities that work with Pongamia today. So in India, where we do work directly with farmers who are already working with Pongamia, we see two different approaches to making Pongamia part of a system. One is what we would call agroforestry, truly where you're alternating the crop with other crops.
Right.
Tree crops, and Pongamia is no different, take a few years to establish a harvestable yield.
Mhm.
In those early years, you get a lot of light and a lot of resources still coming to the farm field. So we plant annual crops that are regionally specific In some parts of the world, it could be a commodity like sorghum. It could be a fresh fruit and vegetable like pineapple. And as the trees come up and get more economically productive, you can turn that cycle over to more reliance on the Pongamia. The other thing we see is an intercropping where you're genuinely going to keep different crops in production in a consistent way. Another example we draw on from traditional communities is coffee production in India, where you've got a shade tree in the form of Pongamia with an understory, a coffee production that can benefit the legume, fixing additional nitrogen in the soil benefits the coffee tree that also needs the shade to be productive. So we'll see more of those types of systems in the future, we believe, not only in traditional communities, places like India, but also in more commercial agriculture geographies, like the US and Australia.
I was impressed by the way that you're working with smallholder farmers, particularly women in India, and paying above market wages. How do you work with those farmers? What's the program consist of?
Well, it starts with buying what the farmer makes today. And that's where we begin. We buy the harvest that they either cultivate from their community trees or that they go into the wild harvest, right? The public forest areas to gather and to sell. And when you help a farmer make a living today, they're much more interested in building a long-term relationship with you tomorrow. And so it's really engaging them today in their traditional collections, which might be as little as a few dozen kilo. Uh,
Mhm.
a small regional group of women who might aggregate supply and have a ton or two. And we help connect them to higher value markets so we can afford to pay more, in part because we take the attributes of what they do and we make them visible to the market. In the energy markets, for example, oil seeds are used as an input to make liquid fuels, things
Mhm.
like sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel. And there's real concern that if you're taking soybeans that are displacing habitat to put in a jet plane, that you're contributing to climate change as much as you're, providing an alternative to a fossil fuel.
Mhm.
So we trace end to end the community level collections that we deliver to ultimately the end refiner. And for making that traced connection, the end refiner has greater confidence and has customers who want that confidence that we're not displacing a natural area and contributing to climate change on the back end, and they pay a premium. We do that with certifications, which enables us to then deliver that extra value back in the purchase price and to the market participants along the way who store and crush and make those end products. So that's that real intention there so that we can be engaged in the conversation of purpose planted acres and growing more cultivation in a long-term relationship.
Well, and as I listen to you and the range of yields that you're talking about, it sounds like you could even integrate urban farming into this because these trees could provide shade, reduce heat effect, and so forth, while producing the fruit. How should we think about recalibrating not just our agricultural land, but our entire landscape to be consistently regenerative in the cities and in the country as we shift into this new era?
It's a thoughtful prompt, Mitch. The absence of imagination is not a permanent human condition. Sometimes the stress and the scarcity we experience pushes us to
Hmm.
see things in areas where we haven't. I'll give you two quick examples. One are boundary plantations. Traditionally, in large monoculture, agricultural enterprises, we've seen a focus on a core farm landscape, and then there's the farm roads and the boundary areas.
Yeah.
Uh, we do a lot of work in Northeast India in the tea plantation region, where you can travel for miles in tea estates that have been planted the same way for 150 years. Turns out that they have been planting Pongamia incidentally almost as a as a boundary plantation to keep the road soils, right, from putting all of that material into the edge of the tea plantation, reducing erosion, to gather water and prevent flooding, for the transport and the effective management of a broader orchard system. And they realized, geez, these trees thrive on the edge of fields because they get some of the runoff, because they get lots
Mhm.
of light. They're great windbreaks that make the tea plantation, the core plantation, more productive. And some of our partners have already begun taking those the leaf litter and the bean pods from the Pongamia trees, and tapping them for those bioactive compounds to provide a natural pest protection to spray back on their tea leaf.
Interesting.
So you see organically, right, a system coming. If we can deliver them consistently high yielding trees, they have a secondary crop. Similarly, if you look at, so that's that sort of edge system. In
Hmm.
the state of Florida, you see the growth as you see in many areas, traditional agriculture of renewable energy. Florida, it happens to be solar panels because it's the sunshine state. When you put a solar array in, you're tilting it in a particular orientation to maximize the sun exposure. And regulation says you can only make it so big. And then you end up with all these leftover parcels, right? These odd lot bits and pieces that traditionally were too small to farm on their own. But taken together as a portfolio, these little triangles, these sort of little end pieces could be highly productive orchards, um, just distributed. Again, not in a traditional monocrop block. And so
Hmm.
we're working with partners like those who haven't traditionally thought about those edge areas, those interstitial spaces as places to farm, and where having both secondary crops, having incremental sources of revenue, turning the cost of land management into the benefit of farming, um, bring more crop into production, and that's really exciting for us.
It's really a fascinating vision of a great green fill-in that takes advantage of all the waste that we have built into the structure of our cities and our communities. I want to take a quick commercial break, but we want to come back and talk a lot more. Thanks, Mark. We'll be right back. Now let's get back to the discussion with Marc Diaz. He's Chief Commercialization Officer at Terviva. It's a food and biofuels innovation company that has adopted the Pongamia tree as the basis for its regenerative agricultural programs, and it's aimed at low-income farmers in India and recently the United States. So, Mark, one of the things that I noticed is you've just signed deals with Chevron and Idemitsu. They've invested in scaling Pongamia cultivation for biofuel and to make sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. What do these partnerships enable for Terviva that wasn't possible before?
Pongamia, like many tree crops, is really a generational investment.
Hmm.
So you need to be looking at the product you want to deliver, the money you want to make, and the change you want to have in the world over a 25, 30-year period. And so we needed big global partners who had that same decision-making time frame and the resources to operate on a generational scale.
Hmm.
So grateful for groups like Chevron, Idemitsu, Mitsubishi, who've all invested in Terviva's business system because that 25-year time period lines up with our 2050 goals for net zero as a global community. Sometimes you got to be lucky and good, and we think we're both to be offering a crop in this market moment where we're still too far away from pure electrification, where we won't need liquid fuels to help us fly our big planes, to
Hmm.
help us manage our large industrial equipment. Things, for example, like Idemitsu might use in the mining sector, where they own direct mines that they use to provision the products, the inputs that we need to make the steel and other types of development focused end products that are going to be needed, over the generations to come. Same on, Chevron being able to provide low cost, low carbon jet fuel to comply with the global community that says we want to move to net zero on aviation by the middle of the century. And we also want to fly more people than ever before, longer distances. And so the drop-in replacement of our existing fossil-based jet fuel system is essential if we want to keep things like transport affordable, accessible. So those partners say, here's a new source of supply with a carbon footprint that's 75% lower than the fossil standard that creates these co-benefits in communities like we were talking about in the last segment. Also, I can match over the next 25 years my source of supply. I basically get a green oil well, which is a really familiar business to them,
Yeah, and
right?
it
They
continues
have
to
a
yield too.
Exactly right. So I've got a tree that I can point to, look at, know is there. I have a predictable amount of yield because I've partnered with Terviva that's got a track record of planting and delivering these same trees, this team of super trees that as a system deliver that yield year in and year out because they're resilient, whether it's a hotter year or a cooler year, whether it's a wetter year or a drier year within reasonable system boundaries, right? We as a partnership set, the agri-tech company, the big global distributor, come together and help work our way responsibly through this transition. And that's the exciting vision they're helping us lift up right now.
One of the things that comes up every time we talk about a biofuel or a sustainable aviation biofuel is the competition between the use of agricultural land for fuel production and for human food consumption. How do you make decisions and balance the sustainability values of Terviva with the operational goals of these large partners like Chevron or Idemitsu?
Well, it's an important point to hold. We focus on it at the level of every bean we produce and every field we plant. At the level of every bean we produce, our Pongamia oilseed, our bean, is 1/3 oil and 2/3 high protein flour.
Hmm.
That's an important contribution. So every time you add a Pongamia tree into the food system and harvest a bean, you're adding 1 part potential biofuel feedstock and 2 parts human or animal food. And that's no small thing. We need that contribution of incremental yield. And we do it off of a 5 meter tall platform that, compared to, let's say, a soybean, which is a similar type of crop,
Hmm.
only a meter tall, an annual crop that also discharges carbon every time you cut it down each year, right? We hold that higher yield per acre over a longer period of time without that negative carbon attribution. The second thing we think about is every field we plant.
Hmm.
If we go in and plant in the area where we're competing with where a great food crop could grow, we're not making a net contribution. So the superpower of our tree is, in fact, to take land that's on the sidelines off the sidelines, either because it's called a wasteland, it's desertified, it's traditionally outside of the boundaries of the heat profile or the water profile, right, for a more conventional crop, or because there are pressures in the environment from pests, from degraded, depleted soils that can't be overcome. I'll give you an example. We're working with colleagues in Belize who are cultivating sugarcane at a large scale. They're really energized about the idea of using Pongamia to revitalize land where the sugarcane they're producing has had significant declines in yield through depleted soils and an absence of revitalization. Will help them to strengthen back those soils and take the most marginal areas of production out. And a generation from now, they may choose to put those back into sugarcane production without having sacrificed productivity, adding human food into the system, and also
Hmm.
energy.
So let's talk about the food products that can be produced from Pongamia. You mentioned the flour. So what could the flour be used for? I know it's a high protein flour too.
It's a great flower that has a few interesting characteristics. The first is, as you noted, the nutritional balance. A high protein flour in a time where, I don't know about you, but every aisle of the grocery store, they seem to be trying to pack the protein in
Yeah.
to everything I'm eating, from my pastas, where this is a great high protein, but also it's quite resilient in its form, a gluten-like property without those gluten attributes that, cause the upset stomach or
Hmm.
simply, don't agree with people's dietary choices. What does that mean? If you get something like perhaps like a chickpea flour, a lentil flour into a pasta, you boil it up and you notice it kind of has either that sort of fibrous quality or kind of breaks apart. Pongamia as a flour has that bounce, that hold together, that firmness that we all like al dente. And so that's an example of one of the products where we're really shining. And it speaks to the functionality and the nutrition of the flour. Another thing that we think about is we're adding protein to new forms of plant-based foods. And so you're looking for something that might have good water holding capacity if you're
Right.
going to be in a beverage. And that's a place where, a high protein beverage, Ripple is made with yellow pea again. You've got to put a lot of stuff into that and shake it up really well to keep it in suspension and to integrate well. We find our plant protein does a great job in those types of applications.
Now, you mentioned that the tree's bioactive ingredients are bitter. What's the smell or flavor profile of the Pangamia oil? And have you tested this with chefs and product developers? What's their feelings about it?
Sure. So in nature, you'll find the Pongamia tree has a kind of a pungent quality, a very kind of back of your mouth sort of snap to it. And so what we've done is we've used existing food processing technology and systems to be able to dial that down. And by dialing that down, we've gotten it to a level that has this, preserves this beautiful golden color, for example, in the Pongami oil. When we've dialed down the flavor profile and made it golden, we call it Panova. We've taken a
Mhm.
strategy that rapeseed and canola did to distinguish the wild crop of rapeseed from canola, the oil that you or I could go to the store and get. So we've got it dialed down, but we haven't gotten rid of it. We didn't want to make a vanilla corn oil, soy oil, kind of, by your ankles in the grocery store type of product. And we consulted all sorts of chefs from, folks who work in haute cuisine to folks who formulate for the big packaged food companies. And
Mhm.
they said, can you get me something that's beautiful? And so our oil is jewel-like, a gorgeous amber glow. Can you get me something that plays well with other ingredients? So we do. Ours has two qualities that chefs and formulators lift up. A buttery mouthfeel. It coats, it integrates, it holds together. Our signature product, our first release product with Panova oil, is the Aloha Bar. The Aloha Bar is a lovely nutritional bar that takes a set of natural ingredients and uses the Panova oil as the backbone that integrates them, that holds them all together. So you don't get that crumbly granola bar feel or that kind of tacky feel you might get in other types of nutrition bars. The other aspect that we like a lot is that while it has a golden buttery flavor, it typically enhances in cooked or in formulated applications some of the visual qualities. So it browns beautifully for chefs who cook. It coats evenly, and so you get a nice finish or crisp. Whether again you're pan frying a chicken breast, making an egg, using the oil directly, or a formulator is looking for an evenness in the quality of the product that they're packaging up.
Yeah, you mentioned traceability earlier when we were talking about fuel, but you've also got the potential to tell consumers about the source and benefits that were created by growing the product that made the product that they're buying. How are you trying to provide that environmental impact, social impact, and regenerative benefits information to consumers?
It's where people's minds and mindsets have shifted. We expect to know not only everything we want to know about the product we're using, but also where did it come from and who touched it along the way.
Hmm.
Rightly or wrongly, we don't have the luxury of hiding that in commodities and supply chains, and so we've partnered with companies who want to lift that up. Aloha did that. Aloha Foods did that with their first bar product called the Kona Bar, this nutrition bar that included Panova oil. And when they released the bar, they did two things that were powerful. They told the story of the farms in Hawaii where we harvested the Pongamia beans and made them into the panova that went into that Kona bar. They told it on the package,
Hmm.
visually, showing the tree, truly an image of a bean and the tree in a lovely illustration. And there was a QR code where you could go in on the back of pack, if you wanted to go to a website and see the actual farm where the produce came from, to see the farmers in Hawaii who were bringing it in. And so that level of storytelling and partners who are committed to that, are required if we're going to lift up the kind of ingredients we want to use. By the way, the market validated that. This was one of their most successful new product launches ever, and they sell it at a higher gross margin than conventional products. So what we do know is that if uh, accurate, sincere, right, and consistent with the values that the consumer has, consumers are willing to pay a little bit more for something that they believe is truly differentiated.
Well, yeah, there's a story there that makes the value come to the fore for them. But and here's one that you're working with Florida and California growers who have lost citrus trees. Is there an opportunity here to create a regional food supply and use that storytelling to really get people to buy into purchasing locally or regionally produced Panova products?
I think there is. Absolutely, Mitch. I think particularly, in the case of Florida, Florida built a whole brand around orange juice,
Mhm.
not generically, but Florida's own. Florida's Natural is even a brand, right, which
Mhm.
speaks to that. And the way in which that can occur in our view is that more and more the economics of moving product from one part of the world around the world twice, to process it and to get it to an end market, are running into the realities of tariffs, trade policy, and supply chain shocks and high energy prices, right? And so, two reasons are, in our view, regionalizing production. One, there's not a big differential in wages across the farming world, across the manufacturing world, the way there was 30 or 40 years ago.
Mhm.
Still gaps, still differences, but it's not necessarily the big return, right, by growing it in the cheap place and selling it in the expensive place. The second is you're seeing real efficiency in scaled regional production, right? More and more, the big, mega plants that produce hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons a year of grain or product, they don't carry the per unit economic cost advantage. In fact, being able to book out your plant in advance with customers who have more stable pricing is attractive. So we could see Florida Panova products, for example, tapping into the existing infrastructure in the orange juice industry, right? The same
Mhm.
plants, the same storehouses. We even use an old citrus packing house to have our small scale processing equipment for a lot of our sampling and demo work. And we think as the industry grows in Florida, those physical assets, the backhaul of transport, right, from the farm field to
Yep.
areas, will be really valuable. And then, you have to be a bit creative and you reimagine those products that come from places. I'm often reminded that even in American agriculture, the face of areas like our kind of Great Plains have changed over time, right? What used to produce oats to power the fuel of the 19th century, horses,
Yep.
today produces corn and soy that powers jet planes and puts foam into cushions and also feeds lots of animals to make the hamburgers and the chicken tenders that are the backbone of our diet.
I think that's a really inspiring way of thinking about what we can do with the development of this entire agricultural infrastructure that we are desperately needing to reorient to the climate era. You mentioned earlier society's goal to be net zero by 2050. What's Terviva's goal to be net zero? When will you, or are you currently well on the way toward being net zero or minimally impactful?
Yeah, so to our own net zero goals, we're functionally a technology company, so we have it sort of easy, right? As a
Hmm.
team of around 100 folks, most of whom you end up working behind screens or in labs or even in farming and nursery environments, we're often transferring our technology to partners. Our footprint is pretty modest. We spend a lot more time helping our partners think about how they achieve their climate goals. I'll
Hmm.
give you two areas of real focus for us today. One is on scope three emissions for a lot of the big agri companies, food and agri companies around the world. And the second is around how you accelerate the intermediate targets to 2030. So let's take those two in turn. On
Okay.
scope three, if you were to go to, the Unilevers, the Nestle's, 95+% of their carbon footprint is in their agricultural supply chain.
Hmm.
It's really scary for them in particular because regardless of the local market politics, those industry leading global firms have already set where they need to be on the horizon line. And they have huge incumbent brands and product categories that rely on things like soy and palm, right, to power those products. So they're not easy to turn over. And those broad crop categories are creating a lot of carbon overhang because, again, they need more of them. All those markets are growing. And so they need to not only address the existing base of, billions of dollars of production but also the incremental growth they're going to drive by selling more of the same. And so having products where you can reformulate with no real functional difference at a price that the product can bear, but with a dramatically lower footprint. I mean, we can have the footprint of soy without the indirect land use contribution, because again, we're working in areas that are outside of the farming system, right,
Hmm.
or minimally productive. That's really important to them. So we're spending a lot of time trying to think about how we migrate that scope 3 system. And then, to the point of the intermediate goals, one of the challenges a lot of firms have are, everyone's thinking about 2050, but how do they get to 2030, a 40% reduction, for example? One of the ways they can do it is to start to allocate, to assign these low carbon intensity fuels, for example, within their book of business, their own
Sure.
to the most who are, to the most forward leaning. And so we help them to match from our wild harvested source of supply that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. We help to match today, bringing thousands of tons of product to bear for the customers they care most about. And we kind of tip the scale, right? We start to be the leading indicator of what they can do over the next 25 years, right? In the first five, and help them to make the kind of big gains early on, the 75% reduction by taking the dirtiest piece of fossil they might have in their energy mix out and putting in this super clean, low carbon intensity, with co-benefit feedstock for the customers they have, right, who have again the most forward-leaning targets for 2030. And so that's that strategy, where as an enabler, an accelerant of decarbonization, we feel like Terviva can be a great partner to big organizations in the energy space, like the Chevrons, Mitsubishis, Idemitsus, and in the food and agri space.
Pongamia is quite a story, and thank you for starting to peel back some of the complexity of the tale. How can people stay tuned to both your food and fuel efforts?
Well, as you move forward, listeners and folks who care about these topics, there'll be two areas where you'll see Terviva doing more and Pongamia doing more. The first is we don't sneak up on anyone. So we're going to be announcing some big planting commitments with product companies and landowners and farming partners in areas of the world, in particular India, Southeast Asia, and Latin America in the next couple of years, with an eye to growing our platforms that already exist in the US, Australia, and Belize. And the reason we're doing that is really, once we have a base of supply in each of these places, a whole industry can grow up around it.
Hmm.
So the first thing you'll see is commitments to farm to bring high quality trees that we have a lot of performance history on and that we can produce in an affordable way to these farming communities. The second thing you'll see is we'll start to lift up the specific products for their low carbon and social and environmental benefit. The way that shows up in food will be through Panova. Today
Mhm.
it's Panova oil. In the next couple of years, you'll start to see more products with Panova protein. In the energy space, it will be by having the story of Pongamia, right? The green oil well, the field to fuel story told. We think as some of our refinery partners do their first deliveries of fuel to end customers, that you'll see more of those aviation customers in particular tell the story. Our CEO was recently featured in Hawaiian Airlines simply because Hawaiian wanted to talk about the types of Pongamia trees that were already growing in Hawaii, that were coming as the future source of fuel, the future source of food for visitors who make that long trip wherever they're coming from over an open ocean, and who want to have a great time while they're on vacation, but don't want to do a lot of damage to get there. And so that to me is the hope that listeners will start to see those stories from us and start to expect those stories from the kinds of solutions we're using in decarbonization. Not enough to do less bad, right? But to really lift up the way we're remaking and improving landscapes and communities and all the places that we farm.
Well, Mark, I hope that we achieve that vision. I appreciate the time you took to tell us the story today. It's been fascinating.
Thank you so much, Mitch, and to your listeners for hanging on with us. I'm excited to share the story of Terviva and Pongamia as we look ahead, and always open for these types of great exchanges.
You've been listening to my conversation with Marc Diaz of Terviva, an ag tech innovator focused on developing food and fuel from the Pongamia tree. Learn more about the company at terviva.com and check out panovafoods.com to find more information about the Panova oil flour and oil products that will be coming to market soon. We live at a time when the food supply is stressed by drought, extreme weather, and soil depletion due to over-fertilization and destructive tilling practices. It's beginning a radical change in composition. Add to that the demand for sustainable fuels to keep society and supply chains moving, and it's clear the Pongamia is just one of many changes in the field that we're going to see over the next 2 or 3 decades. But change is what humans do. I mean, consider corn or maize, as most of the world knows the grain. It was introduced as a major crop only about 150 years ago. In fact, it rose with the industrial era to become a global crop, one of the first. Perhaps we will see the Pongamia and other potentially sustainable crops that can be used to make food and fuel, including camelina, moringa, kernza, or azolla, which is an aquatic fern, become household staples, something we all refer to with the same familiarity that we do corn and wheat. The Pongamia's flexibility. It can be a field crop that replaces orange production in California and Florida, as well as an urban tree that could be harvested by urban farmers while cooling their communities. That flexibility will be key to developing a diverse mixed cropping strategy that displaces the increasingly fragile monocropped approach that can be disrupted by a single pathogen, mold, or invasive insect. For example, among the things that we count on today that are under threat include wheat, rice, corn, and bananas. We could see the Pongamia grown as part of a polyculture, the mixing of crops grown concurrently, or as part of regenerative strategies that rely on the tree's shade to support an ecosystem of crops grown amid Pongamia trees to provide a diverse food supply. Native Americans practiced polyculture, planting what they described as the three sister crops, maize, beans, and squash. Mixed crops are more resistant to disease and pests, but we need not just three sisters, but dozens of new plants to step into the growing gaps in the industrial food supply. So, how do we reach scale? I think we can find a lot of inspiration in what Mark described about Terviva's work with women farmers in India. It's just one example of starting at the bottom of the ladder and cultivating a global market from the edges, with people gathering Pongamia beans for local use or to be shipped for processing into fuel or food. The next generation of agricultural crops will not replace one single plant with another single plant, but intermix with others in new combinations that fit local contexts. We also need to think about balancing fuel production with the demand for food, and that trade off may be the hardest to negotiate if fossil fuel companies shift entirely toward fuel producing crops. They have the money to dominate agricultural planning, and that could lead to another round of monocropping. But we're not just talking about what grows in fields, and that's where new food and fuel economies can be built around other technologies, particularly biomanufacturing. We have the ability to make foods, including dairy fats, animal-free proteins, sweeteners, and many other valuable sources of nutrition, along with fuel, often from CO2 captured from the atmosphere. The Pongamia is just one piece of a new food and fuel puzzle, and many of those pieces are ready for widespread testing and deployment. So stay tuned. We will continue to talk with the people leading this, dare I say it, revolution. And would you take a moment to share this or any of the more than 500 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear with one of your friends or family right now? You know, writing a review on your favorite podcast platform will help your neighbors find us. As I say every week, folks, you're the amplifiers that can spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find Sustainability in Your Ear on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and whatever purveyor of podcast goodness they prefer. Thanks, folks, for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.